All right, today we're tackling a really subtle but incredibly powerful spiritual struggle, scrupulosity. We're going to explore how this trap can flip faith from a source of absolute joy into a source of constant, crushing anxiety. And, more importantly, we're going to talk about how to get out.
Have you ever felt that? That gut-wrenching feeling, that one wrong thought, one imperfect prayer, or just one tiny misstep could somehow just extinguish God's love for you. It's this feeling of being totally paralyzed, like you're walking on eggshells all the time, just worried sick that you've done something to mess it all up. If any of that sounds familiar, believe me, you are not alone.
Well, this feeling actually has a name, scrupulosity. And where the word comes from is so perfect. It's from the Latin scrupulus, which means a tiny pebble. Just think about that for a second, like a tiny pebble that gets in your shoe. At first it's just this minor annoyance, but if you keep walking on it, it becomes this huge, burdensome weight that makes every single step painful. It's this chronic habit of seeing sin absolutely everywhere, especially in yourself.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, so this is just about being extra holy or having a really sensitive conscience, right? But here's the twist, the thing that's so counterintuitive about it. Scrupulosity isn't really about focusing on God at all. It's actually a disguised but really intense form of self-focus.
C.S. Lewis just nails this shift perfectly. You see, real faith is supposed to lead to what he calls buoyant humility, this feeling of lightness, of joy and hope. But when our focus turns inward to all our anxieties, scruples, and motive scratchings, as he puts it, that joy just evaporates, and it's replaced by terror. The focus becomes our own spiritual performance, not God's actual glory. There's a perfect analogy for this in the movie Amadeus. We can call it the Salieri effect. So the composer Salieri, he prays to God, and he promises to be humble and chaste, but what's he really after? He wants to be the greatest composer ever, he wants fame. It's a deal, it's a contract. And that is the absolute heart of scrupulosity. The focus shifts from loving God to my piety, my sinlessness, my salvation. You end up devoted to a plan, not to a person.
So what does this self-focus actually look like in practice? Well, we can spot it in 4 pretty clear signs. First, there's this irrational fear that you could just stumble into a major sin by complete accident. Second, you start to believe that God's love is incredibly fragile, like it can be snuffed out by your mistakes. Third, there's a constant, nagging, relentless obsession with your own flaws. And fourth, you get fixated on the outside stuff, worrying if you said a prayer perfectly or if a ritual was done with exact precision. You can see how this just turns a living, breathing faith into a cold, joyless, mathematical calculation.
And look, this struggle is not new. Not at all. It is a profound spiritual battle that has affected some of the biggest names in history. So let's look at 2 souls who faced this exact same trial, but whose responses sent them down completely different paths.
So get this. On one hand, you have Martin Luther, and on the other, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. Both of them were terrified by the exact same things: divine justice and their own sinfulness. Luther was so obsessed he would spend hours and hours in confession, but their responses? Polar opposites. To escape his terror, Luther ended up rejecting the Church's authority, and his personal struggle created his theology of faith alone. Thérèse, facing that exact same fear, did the complete opposite. She leaned into the Church, she got a spiritual director, and she came up with her little way of just trusting in God's overwhelming mercy. She conquered her anxiety and is now a doctor of the Church. Same struggle, 2 totally different outcomes.
Okay, so we've seen the trap, and we've seen the incredibly high stakes involved. But the good news is that there is a way out. So let's talk about a clear path forward, with some really powerful, practical antidotes to this fear. Okay, the first and most critical antidote is just clarity. Facts have to trump feelings and doubts. According to Catholic teaching, for a sin to be mortal, and that means a sin that totally severs your relationship with God, 3 conditions must all be met, every single one. The act has to be seriously wrong, you have to know it's seriously wrong, and you have to freely and deliberately choose to do it anyway. If any one of those is missing, especially that deliberate consent part, it is not a mortal sin, period.
And this brings us to this classic Christian principle, perfectly captured in the phrase, in dubiis libertas. In doubtful things, there is liberty. For anyone struggling with scrupulosity, this is a lifeline. And here is the key takeaway. If you are genuinely in doubt about whether you gave deliberate consent, that very doubt is a sign that you didn't. Where there is doubt, there is freedom, not condemnation.
So let's boil this all down into 4 clear steps. Number 1,
Know the real definition of sin and let that hard fact conquer your feelings of doubt. Number 2, trust that God's love is not something you earn. The source material uses this great analogy. The princess kisses the frog, not because he's a handsome prince, but because she loves him, and that love is what transforms him. God loves you because he is love. Number 3, you have to accept your own imperfection. Remember that parable about the wheat and the weeds? The master is patient. You got to trust him to handle the weeds in his own time. And finally, number 4, shift your focus from a plan to a person. The goal is not to check off a religious to-do list, it's to build a real relationship with Jesus.
This quote from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux is just a powerhouse mantra against scrupulosity. He would say this to the devil whenever he felt like his motives for doing good weren't perfectly pure. He was basically saying, yeah, I know I'm imperfect, but I'm not going to let that paralyze me. He understood that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We are all just stumbling saints in the making, and that is more than okay.
And that brings us to our final and really our most central idea. Escaping this trap of scrupulosity, it all comes down to one fundamental shift in how you see things.
So, why does all this matter so much? Because this isn't some rare, bizarre disorder. The sources call it an occupational hazard for anyone who takes their moral life seriously. Think about that. If you genuinely care about doing the right thing, you are actually more vulnerable to this trap. Understanding it is absolutely key to keeping both your sanity and a healthy, joyful spiritual life.
And so we're going to end with this question, because it really gets to the heart of everything we've talked about. Is your faith all about perfectly executing a plan, checking all the boxes, following all the rules? Or is it about a living, breathing relationship with a person who loves you, not because you're perfect, but simply because he is love itself? That's the question we want to leave you with today.